Hey, it's Chris. This is the review log. I just couldn't resist that name. I'm sorry. Number one, first up on the review log, you may be familiar with this game as it was on Kickstarter back in April and May in 2020. And if you were like me, I'll be completely frank and transparent here at the beginning of the video. I looked at this and I said, wow, that's some really great art, just like a lot of other people. But then my second reaction was, I bet there's no game with it. I bet it's just one of those games where they just have a really, really attractive art presentation and the game behind it is going to be bleh. Because we've all seen those on Kickstarter, right? Especially on Kickstarter. You know what I'm talking about. So I went in this, I'll be frank with you again. I did not even look at the page when this was going on. I looked at it, I judged a print by its cover. And I didn't even look into the mechanics, I didn't look into anything else. All I knew about the game was that it used the transparent cards and you overlaid them and there you go. I blew it off, completely blew it off. And then when it started getting delivered earlier in the year, and a little bit more of the mechanisms, and a little bit more of the, dare I say, hype, I was more intrigued. Now, if you're not familiar with what Canvas is a 1 to 5 player, card overlapping, card overlaying puzzle type game, where you are trying to create your own individual masterpiece. In fact, you're trying to make 3 individual masterpieces in order to, as with many of these games, as you know, score the most points. Now, how are you doing the scoring? How does it actually work? What does it look like? That's where the tricky side of things comes in. What you're doing is using this little fancy mat, and you've got your 4 colors, right? No big deal. They each have scoring conditions. Meet that scoring condition on your final painting, get a ribbon. Earn a number of ribbons equals numbers of points at the end of the game. You can see the 5 spaces here as well on the board. You put 1 card out on each spot. Now, okay, Chris, sounds relatively straightforward. What's the big deal? Why would I even look at this and why would I even be interested? So 1, this is a nice cloth mat. So the presentation in this game needs to be stated that it is top-notch. Top-notch. I have a retail version of the game. It is very aesthetically pleasing. Make no bones about that. Now, with that being said, how do you actually make those cards work? How do you even acquire them? Now, if you're familiar at all, Century Spice Road or Century Golem or that type of game where you have said cards splayed out in front of you, how do you decide which one to get? Because as you saw with that mat, I've got more than a couple just sitting here. And as you can see, they all have a little bit of variation at the bottom. Nothing dramatic, but you can start to see, as I put these together, what it looks like. And you can see that sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they don't. So, how do you decide, as I was saying? Well, it uses that Century mechanic of you have very limited resources. See this color palette, right? And you have 4 of them. Only 4. Everybody gets 4. It's a very limited resource, but it is a reusable resource because as you play them down to get the one you want, because you can get the one on the very end for free. Each subsequent one that you want to skip, you need to put one of those down. And then you can take whichever one you want to get to, or whichever one you can get to. And if you take one with those palettes on top, you get to keep them and use them for your own. So it adds a layer of strategy right in there because there are plenty of games that I've played where if you don't use those wisely, you are stuck taking whatever is left at the end that is either free or for 1. So again, okay, relatively straightforward, Chris. Well, you see, with these cards, there are about 5 different symbols on the bottom. No big deal. But because all of the color scheme as well is different, you need to be careful on what you're getting color-wise, what you're getting shape-wise, and what you're getting bonus point-wise. Does that sound like a lot? It probably doesn't. But do not kid yourself. Having played this several times, and having used the various objective cards, and there are plenty, there are 12 different in total when you're only using 4 at a time per game, you can definitely make this game very nice and zen-like. You can also make this game very thinky. And therein lies the both positive and negative with this game. Because as a positive note, you can scale it to however you want. Now, on the positive side, the rulebook does a great job at giving you the ability to scale the game however you want. And to be honest, that's also the downside of things. The downside in that sense, that it goes from being a enjoyable time to a somewhat racking time. You never quite know what you're going to get with these, because let me be clear, this is a very thick stack, folks, of cards you're going to be getting. And these are just everything under the metaphorical sun. There is a high degree of randomness. And with a higher player count, you have very little control over what is going to be on the board in terms of picking one of these out by the time it gets around to you. If you do not like that inability to have a strategic plan several turns in advance, this game is not going to appeal to you. Period. This game is highly tactical in nature, but I would be lying if I did not say part of the goodness of this game is drafting these, not knowing exactly how you're going to put them together, and then figuring it out to somehow maximize the score based on your objectives and what you have down below. It can be equally rewarding and frustrating at the same time. If you have a Kickstarter version of the game, there were extra cards, extra objectives. Are they necessary? No. 12 is plenty. You have plenty of variety and options there. If you're a deluxeification fan, though, this game also offers a little bit of that. As you can imagine, a game about making paintings and canvases would be not complete without the inclusion of easels. And so you can actually hold up your paintings with said easels. So if you like that sort of thing and you like making a pretty game prettier, it has that in spades. Deluxeifications abound on the first Kickstarter. The ribbons that are used to score, they come in wooden as well. So again, making it prettier and more aesthetically pleasing. Is it necessary? No. Am I a huge fan of it? No. But I know that there are plenty of people out there that are. And so it's a nice ability to customize if you prefer that. Me personally, I can pass on the deluxeification side of things if the deluxeification is not going to add to gameplay. Another positive that I think cannot be understated is when you look at some of these objective cards, for example, you may not be able to easily tell, okay, what does that actually mean when it's talking about that? Because it doesn't give the biggest description on this side. However, when you flip this card over, it lays it out very succinctly, very directly, and very nicely. I wish this sort of translation or ability not to have to flip open a manual 16 times in the first or second game would be translated into other games. That is by far one of the biggest benefits from a quality of life standpoint when it comes to a board game I have seen in a long time. I loved that fact, that when I was explaining the game, it was easy to teach, and if you had a question about this, you just flipped it over, and everyone could read it. They could look at it themselves. There was no me having to be the teacher and look up everything in the rulebook every 30 seconds at the beginning of the game when people were not aware or clueless about what that was, especially the first couple times you play one of these. Because like I said, there are many, so you're not being able to learn all of them right away, and they are different enough that they're not all intuitive necessarily based off of the pictures and the symbology that's there. They're not complicated, but they're also needing a little bit more explanation because there are nuances to all of them as well. I'm done with the dramatic effect with the lights, but one of the other negatives I will say, and I'm not sure if this is in just my copy, if this is a retail thing, if this is a printing issue, as in terms of first printing, second printing, whatever, is some of the coloration does not match. For example, here is 2 purples. And it's hard to tell here, but let me assure you that these are 2 distinctly different purples. And so it's a minor thing, let's be clear, but it's also a production thing. Did it take away the enjoyment? No, not at all. But it was just something I noticed when I was playing it. So what do I think? What is my overall impression? Like I said at the beginning of the video, I was highly skeptical of this game. Highly. But I had heard enough hype that I thought it was worth a shot. Again, disclaimer, Road to Infamy, the publisher of this game, reached out to me and said, hey, would you talk about this game? And I said, you know what? It had been on my try before I buy list. Sure. Let's see what it was. Let's see how it actually is. And again, I will say, I was pleasantly surprised. The puzzly aspect of this game cannot be understated. This looks very simplistic and very artsy, but there is a serious AP issue when you get to some of these more complex ones, because you are also just not going to get the things you need, especially at the higher player counts. And that is going to frustrate or delight depending on your personal preference. I thrive in the chaos. So for me, this game was fine from that aspect. But several of the people I played with, they enjoyed it, but it was also an enjoyable frustration, is the best way to describe it. Some of the scoring will just inevitably, you will be unable to do by the sheer lack of just getting anything that is going to suit your needs. And that is mitigated by your ability to hold up to 5 of these at one time before having to make a painting out of 3 of them. But it is not going to ultimately fully mitigate that. And so you will eventually, no matter how many games you play and how good you are, you will have to most likely, especially at the higher player counts again, make a painting that is far less than optimal in terms of what you would have wanted to do, and there would be nothing you could do to necessarily change that. And that is just bound to happen. And if you cannot stand that, or have that happen once in a while, this game is probably not for you in the first place. Now they have an expansion coming out on Kickstarter called Reflections, and that is adding mirroring cards. And from what I can tell, having read the rule book at this point, because they sent me a copy of that as well, it does take my biggest criticism right there of not being able to mitigate when you're given it, and it allows you to have a little bit more mitigation by having cards that you can then flip over to the other side and have opposite colors or symbols on the other side to allow for more variability, more mitigation, like I just said, but at the risk and the expense of more analysis paralysis. High reward, but also high risk in terms of adding complexity to an otherwise relatively straightforward game that is, in all purposes, very easy to get to the table. The overhead is very simplistic. The rules are very straightforward. You saw what is there in terms of the scoring and how easy it is to explain. Whatever set or which one you want to use. But once it's on the table, that is where sometimes the positive and negative shine. And as with all of these games, you have to be aware of how much do I like that versus how much am I willing to put up with that as well. Again, the other big change is, as I showed you with this board, figuratively speaking, because it's, there will be a second row of these art cards. Adding to the mitigation, but also to the complexity. And this is going to be a little divisive, I think, as well, that you have the same way of drafting them from using those little paint tokens. So not only do you have essentially 2 cards at the same price now in a different row, you have that many more options. Because again, being completely transparent, even having played this several times now, what I was taking and why I was taking it, I didn't always, for especially some of the heavier objectives, have a clear plan of how I was going to use it. And if you are a person who needs to have a clear plan of how you're going to use it before you take it, this game is going to be inducingly, frustratingly long. But if you're like me, and you are a little bit more loosey-goosey with it, and you can go with the flow a little bit more, and you'd rather get more games in and deal with what you've got and rearrange them in your hand when you've got them, this game flows very nicely. But it is, as other people have suggested with other games, it reminds me a little bit of, now hear me out, Splendor, in the sense you can literally take your turns going all the way around the table relatively quickly, especially when people are making their paintings, because then they aren't affecting the rows, so the next person can already go. There also isn't probably a whole lot of conversation if you're looking for a game that is going to induce more interaction. And I say that, again, as both a positive and negative. Whatever game banter that your group does may be enough, even though they recommend that you read the painting title based on the cards overlapping, as well as describe the picture. So, there you go. So what do I think at the end? I think this is a game that is sort of a 3 out of 5 for me. In the sense of a 3 being, this is a very good game. But, depending on the time, depending on the circumstances, depending on the group, depending on my own personal tastes at the time, this may not be a game for everyone, by any means, because of those things I said. And, depending on what it is competing against, I think would determine how strongly I feel about keeping this in my collection in the long run. But let me be clear, this is a very unique game, in the sense that I have not really played anything like it, and these cards, with the overlapping, there is just an element of delightfulness in doing it. Whether that's from the delightful frustration of not being able to get the symbols to match up, or just the delightness of making some completely odd picture that no one has ever seen, that induces chuckles of its own. So what am I going to do with it right now? Right now, it's staying in my collection. I'm tempted by the reflections because of the reasons I mentioned before about the ability to more mitigate your circumstances. But, as I mentioned as well, you can guarantee that there are going to be more of these on the Kickstarter. And is that a price you're willing to pay, or are you willing to pick it up at retail? Because the copy of retail that I have is very nice, folks. It's very nice. That, ultimately, is up to you. So, that's Canvas in a nutshell. Way too long of a nutshell. But, that's also review log number 1. So, Reflections will be launching on April 14. You can pick up the base game at retail, with the deluxeifications as well, if you so choose. There you go. As always, thanks for checking out. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you liked it. And if this interests you, definitely check it out. Thanks, guys. Stay classy out there. Have a great week.